Welcome back to the Innovation Engine podcast. I'm Scott Varho, Three Pillars Chief Evangelist, and I'm your co-host for today's episode alongside our banking and financial services industry lead, Rob Murray. Hi, Rob.
Hello, everybody. And hello, Scott. Absolute pleasure to be here.
It's good to have you on. And our guest today is Sam Yen, the Chief Innovation Officer for Commercial Banking at JPMorgan Chase. Sam leads a cross-functional team of more than 100 UX designers, developers, product professionals, and I'm sure a bunch of other craftspeople, delivering digital products, platforms, and services that power the innovation economy. Prior to JPMorgan, Sam was the managing director of SAP Silicon Valley and SAP's very first chief design officer. He was responsible for driving SAP's design and user experience strategy and execution across the company, including leading SAP's design thinking practice both internally and for customers. Sam also has a PhD in design, mechanical engineering, and aero-astro from Stanford University, which just confirms who the smartest person in the room today is. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today on the Innovation Engine. We're really excited to have you on.
Thanks so much, Scott and Rob, for inviting me. I don't know about the smartest, but certainly the most overeducated, maybe.
The most papered. Well, I mean, yeah, we could spend time just trying to decode what you have studied. But I want to jump in a little bit. The JPMorgan Chase Commercial Banking has a tagline, banking the innovation economy. And given that this is the Innovation Engine podcast, we just have to ask you, what does that entail? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm joining you all from Silicon Valley, from Palo Alto, and having grown up here, I've seen the booms and the busts of innovation here. But I think at the end of it, it's an intersection of entrepreneurship and technology, that drives the innovation. And there's opportunities of high growth companies that really kind of change the way that we work and the way that we live. And when you think about the innovation economy from a banking opportunity for us, it's really the intersection and if you bring together that ecosystem of these entrepreneurs, investors, VCs, consumers, customers, big tech, and the partners, the legal partners and everybody. That whole environment is what we think is the innovation economy or the innovation economy ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And we think that from a banking perspective, we bring certain capabilities because we bring the full breadth of the entire firm of not just Chase and JPMorgan, the entire breadth of the firm. There's opportunities that we could do, not just that go way beyond just the core banking services. We could bring together the ability for you to interact with investors and connect with investors, the ability to bring together even software solutions to help you do your billing, to manage your invoices, to set up your merchant services. So altogether, we think there's a big opportunity. And why not start with JPMorgan Chase? Because if you start early, we also have the scale and the breadth to be able to grow with you as you grow.
Yeah, no. I mean, having been in this business long enough to know that there are a variety of incentives and friction points in the intersection of good ideas and capital, and what people are trying to achieve on both sides of that equation, I imagine there's a lot of exciting opportunities, present and future, in this industry, and JPMorgan is an incredible platform. So you're responsible for digital products, platform, innovation, and product strategy. Wow, that's just a lot to say. That's quite a broad remit. And this is for one of the largest financial institutions in the world. So to work at that scale, can you share some of the core guiding principles that help you govern your teams and help them prioritize their work and work towards a shared set of goals with you?
Yeah, look at the start of it, and you said in your introduction to me, I have a design background as well. So being very customer or client centered is really, really important. It's maybe the most fundamental principle. How can we, in everything that we do and every touch point that you have with us, both in person and digitally, really strive to make that a delightful experience and make your lives easier. We have this saying, I didn't come up with it. I wish I did. One of my colleagues did. But if we're a bank and we consider banking products our core offerings, we have to understand that who we're selling these core offerings to, who we're offering these core offerings to, our customers and clients. It's really a chore for them. So our core is actually their chore. their core is running a business, whether it's manufacturing products, selling things, dealing with employees and things like that. So we need to kind of make sure that what we're offering, just really helps them with their core, right? And it's not just banking for banking's sake. We need to understand what it is that our clients are actually trying to do, and how could we be of service to them. And sometimes that goes above and beyond just offering the core banking products.
That's so well said. And it reminds me of there was a chapter in my career when I was working on identity and access management, and I used to tell my team our hugest UX win would be totally forgettable.
Yeah.
No one needs to remember the login experience. This is not what we're trying to, so our innovation is to try to be as invisible of a speed bump as possible. And it's interesting to think of your challenge that way as a designer sometimes.
I mean, there's a couple other principles, I think, just over time. It would be nice. Like we actually don't have like a list that we pass around and everybody reads, but things, common themes along those things, right? Think outside in, not, just within the four walls of the company. One thing I like to say is what's new for JPMorgan Chase doesn't necessarily mean it's new for the world. So, take inspiration from other areas. I think this notion, especially like in Silicon Valley, how do you introduce progress over perfection? How do you get out of the rut of trying to be perfect and not taking a step because you're doing analysis paralysis, and moving forward, taking that first step, getting feedback, or learning from that feedback, quickly iterating. That's also a common principle. Be very clear in your communications, right? One of the advice that I often give to people that are starting their careers is your technical skills will take you so far, but communications and clarity of communications is so important. I heard Satya Nadella kind of give this thing, which I believe in as well. He said there's two types of communications. There's some people that are very good at making simple things sound very, very complicated. And then there's other people that are gifted at taking complicated things and make it sound very simple. Always strive for the second one. And then look, the product is actually an experience, and the experience has to be end to end. So a lot of times we just think about, hey, delivering this feature, but it has to be set in the context of the end to end experience. Like how do your clients even know that you've added this new feature? How do they learn more about it? How do they, what do they do if they need some help as they're trying to get through this capability that you just introduced? So thinking end to end, instead of just really kind of just focusing on the one piece. And then at the end of the day, make an impact, right? What's the broader impact of the things that you're doing? Because that's going to be good for the team, the product that you're working on. But again, it's a bigger picture mentality. How are you making a broader impact, not only for the bank, but the customers that you're trying to serve?
Yeah, Sam, one of the things I really liked, I liked a lot of what you said, if not all of it. The one specific is, just because it's new to JPMC doesn't necessarily, it's new to others, right? And sometimes in banking and having a bit experience there myself, you can get blinders on for a bit, right? And not understand what else is going on out with other fintechs and those types of things that could really make a change within an organization like JPMC.
Absolutely, and that's why sometimes location also helps out. Like I'm here again with all the fintechs that are all around us trying to disrupt us. So it might be good to see what they're working on and see if we could beat them to the path sometimes.
So Sam, as you mentioned, your background is in design and design thinking, and over the years, a lot about how design can earn a seat at the proverbial C-suite table. And then there are some folks that even challenge whether or not design should be at the table. You've been able to do this at two very large organizations, both SAP and JPMorgan Chase. How did you manage that? How did you earn that seat?
Yeah, again, if you think about it, the notion that we need to understand what matters to our clients, it's a C-level message, right? And ultimately, if you think about what design is all about, it's understanding your clients, having empathy for their needs, discovering new opportunities, and being able to deliver delightful experiences and products out of that, right? So it's very much a C-level message. I think the challenge sometimes with design schools is they teach the craft without helping designers going out into larger organizations communicate the value of design to the C-suite. So and sometimes people, if you I'm gonna make enemies of designers right now. But sometimes if you only stick in your design language and terminology, and you're too religious about that, you're missing the bigger opportunity, again, to actually take those principles that you care so much about and actually make a broader impact, because you're influencing stakeholders and decision makers and invited to have a seat at that table. I'll just give one like really, really small example. In Silicon Valley, you hear a lot, "Hey, fail early, fail often," right? That even worked, in the big tech companies that I worked in. It doesn't work so well in a financial institute to say fail early, fail often. But
Those
that notion,
quite costly.
yeah, could be quite costly, regulatory kind of issues, all of that stuff. But you could get the same effect just by changing the language a little bit, right? So instead of saying fail early, fail often, just say, "Hey, can we test? Let's run a small test. What can we learn from that? And what can we adjust very, very quickly," right? It's the exact same principle, but just, having a little bit more empathy in terms of the context that you're in, speaking to an executive audience, not being religious on, the things that were in your textbook, and explaining that you still get the point across, just in a different way.
But I do want to make sure I highlight this point that you're making, Sam, because it is really, really important. And a lot of people misjudge design. And these are even designers, right? Where they believe that they're judged by how the beauty of what they create, rather than the impact or the curiosity that it took to make something really intuitive, and something that is forgettable, let's say. Versus something that's really beautiful or polished or fancy. And I think that's a key misunderstanding of the true potential of design, because it really is that the psychological warfare of creating great products, services, and experiences.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think of the fit and finish, right? What does it look like? How does it feel? And that's an important part of design. But I think from a C-level perspective and a strategic perspective, it's more about who are you building for? Why are you building this? And what are you building in the first place? And that's where the early design research can really, lead to very, very strategic business, decisions. And then, design's involved throughout the entire process, of course.
Financial services, as an industry, is an industry that typically is not synonymous with innovation, right? And many banks I've worked with make an effort to innovate. They may even stand up innovation teams, but when it comes time to implement their projects or ideas, a number of roadblocks tend to appear. Have you found that instilling and executing on a culture of innovation in a large financial institution is a challenge?
Not easy.
Yeah, it's been a challenge, but it's not completely unexpected either. So I would say whether you're whatever industry you're in, there's always going to be a difference in your speed of executing innovations in a smaller, startup organization versus a large established organization, right? So that's always going to be there, regardless of whether you're in financial services as well. Prior to this, I was at SAP. It was a large German software company that had been around for 30 years, and there's a lot of momentum and governance and rules and processes, also mission critical stuff, right? As well. There's of course in financial services the additional layer of financial regulation and that. But maybe there's 2 points I want to make. The first point is, as with any type of creativity, sometimes having some constraints and boundaries actually focuses you and leads to more interesting solutions, right? If you're completely unbounded in terms of your solution space, sometimes you're wandering around and it's hard to really focus. Yeah, I mean, every single solution is going to have some boundary conditions and constraints that you're going to have to deal with, and just knowing what those are up front can actually save some time in the long run. Because if you don't take all those things at the beginning, sometimes those things spring up, and when after you've built the product and you're about to launch, that's not good, right? Because you've spent all that money up front. So understanding those conditions up front actually leads to some interesting conversations and some innovative solutions. The second point is all about risk. And how do you position risk within the organization? Because sometimes in large organizations, and what I found in financial services is there's a tendency to kill off some ideas before they even are able to take their first steps. And I find that if you look at the difference between large organizations and maybe especially kind of within the banking context, the risk tolerance is pretty much the same even at the very beginning. I'm just coming up with an idea versus and typically you'll have the same risk tolerance as this solution scaling to all of our customers, at the same time, right? It's just the same. And what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to say, look, we'll get, by the time we get there and we're going to take our product and we're going to scale it out, we're going to be at the same risk level. But at the beginning, we may take the new ideas may seem like they're higher risk at the beginning, but that whole process between now and then is de-risking it to get down to that level, right? So I would argue that the whole venture process is exactly that, right? You have a pre-seed round, and there's a huge market risk, there's a huge team risk, there's a huge execution risk, and with milestones you get a little bit more incremental funding, but every single time you're de-risking that. So by the point you're getting into Series C and maybe about to go public, that's when you've got your execution risk really down, and that's the kind of model that we're trying to instill here also to take some of those more innovative ideas and make sure it has a little bit of a runway for success. The other way I try to visualize that is, imagine risk is in a line of boxes, right? And on one side of the box, it's like a really, really tiny box. And then each box gets bigger and bigger and bigger until at the end of the line, you've got this huge box. The box represents the risk. And the big box is when you're releasing this to all your customers. But let's take it one box at a time. And let's not try to take all the risks and controls of the biggest box when you're in the first step. And that's helped to kind of help give risk appropriate processes for depending on what stage you're in.
I one of the things I love about your answer is that it acknowledges that any idea has to go through, it has the feature of time, right? So it needs to mature, it needs to grow, and that includes the ROI side of it. How much is it going to? What is the investment? So the I side needs some information, the return side needs some information, and then the risk side needs to follow that as well. And if you have proper, if you have those stage gates, then you could manage all three sides of that triangle, if you will, through the process. But it shouldn't be all pushed up to the very first time the idea is muted, right?
That's right.
Because that'll just kill the very best ideas.
Yeah. And Rob, to go back to your question, it's hard because it's new. Like all these concepts are somewhat new. So you have to show. It takes a couple iterations, right? You have to, okay, this is a new concept. Let's start with something small that you're not going to do a lot of damage. Let's go through this process. Okay, that we didn't get burned by kind of the risks that we were taking because we limited the risk and all that stuff. Now we could do something a little bigger. So it takes a couple iterations.
You're earning that trust to get.
Yeah, what seems to be a common thread, Sam, and you can confirm or deny, is this in having both innovation and design embedded with the entire line of business, technology, right? And so that it's not many banks, at least a couple of FSIs that I had worked with in the past, have made a mistake of innovation, separating innovation and working in a vacuum. Right, not working with the rest of the business and understanding, because there are constraints. There may be legacy systems or those types of things that may impede your ability to execute on something that's very innovative. But with everybody working together, you have a clear line of sight what those constraints and those challenges may be.
Yeah, so I've done similar roles now for a while, and also worked with other companies that are large companies that are trying to figure out, regardless of financial services, right? Large company, how do you prevent being disrupted? And yeah, there's just a lot of innovation drop points that you have to be aware of, right? So if you have a siloed group, it's you've got the concept, but somebody has to take the concept and actually implement it. And if there's no continuity there, then the group that's implementing it, they're not very excited about implementing it. It's not their baby. They weren't involved in it. They said, hey, look, you guys did this in a vacuum. We have all, you defied the laws of gravity, but we have things that we need to do here, right? And then like if you connect that a little bit better, and you've got some connectivity to the actual implementation teams, a lot of times then you build the product, but then you forget the entire go-to-market aspects of it, right? So there's another innovation dropout where the product is according to features and functionality and delivered on time under budget, but then you left out the entire go-to-market, right? So yeah, this is why it's so hard. You just have to you have to thread the needle between, cutting edge, doing it quickly, but kind of involving the organization enough so that they won't reject it, but then not too much where you can't get anything done. I was on one of these innovation panels, and a guy from Cisco. Now I'm putting myself on the spot, and I'm going to get the quote right. He said, one of the challenges of innovation teams in large organizations, you have too much money, too many people, too much love and too much hate at the same time, right? So that's you have to kind of thread that, right?
Right.
Yeah, that seems.
I botched that thing, but it's
yeah. Well, Rob and I have our own war stories that we've exchanged of our own experiences, experiencing exactly that, and yeah, it is challenging to try to figure out that intersection point between, like, how do I free myself of the constraints for a moment to start to think about the art of possible, and then re-engage those constraints in a constructive fashion that doesn't snuff out an idea. It's a really interesting challenge for sure. And in our prep call, you talked about how innovation is a function of both creativity and execution. And I think this is very apropos to the conversation we're just having. Since you don't get to choose to be good at one and not at the other, you can't innovate without either one of them. Can you expand on that and how that adds an additional layer of complexity to what you do, and especially how you then go about scaling it?
Yeah, the whole point of that is to frame innovation as not black and white, but an and, right? So the way I usually present this is, if there's a room full of people, I'll ask, most people kind of agree with the overall definition. Innovation is a function of both creativity and execution, right? You got to get big ideas where there's no innovation, but if you don't take those ideas out to market, if you don't execute on those ideas, that's also not execution, right? So there's a creativity side, there's the execution side. If you ask a room full of executives, how many people feel that you're good at execution, raise your hands. Like, almost everybody raises their hand, right? Because that's what we're measured on. This is what we're all good at. But on the other hand, if you ask a room full of executives, how many of you think of yourselves as creative individuals, right? It's kind of sad. Like 75% of the hands will go down, right? They see themselves as good at execution because, maybe their boss is in the room and this is what they're measured on, right? How many people are measured on their creativity? But there's usually 25% that kind of brave people that keep their hands up. And then I'll ask the follow-up question, and I'll say, well, how many of you feel that you could take your individual creativity and teach your entire organization how to be creative, right? And almost everybody puts their hands down. But then you've got a problem, right? You all agree that innovation is a function of creativity and execution. And for most organizations, right, this pressure of execution is like really, really time bound, right? You got to, you're getting disrupted by your competition, by startups and everything, right? So how do you balance out that innovation equation? And this is, I use that just as a framework to also kind of tell the difference between what is execution and creativity. And this gets back to our earlier point about what is the value of design, right? Execution for me is, how well do you solve problems, right? I know what the problem is, and over time I have an organization, processes, and I'm very, very efficient at solving problems, and that's execution, right? And creativity, like if you think of execution as problem solving, I like to introduce it as problem finding, right? What's the problem worth solving in the first place? Because you need that, right? If you're only solving the same problems over and over and over again, then you're just making your existing things more efficient, and you're getting incremental types of innovation. But the breakthroughs usually come when you question, hey, is that thing that made us successful 5 years ago, 10 years ago still relevant? There's new context, there's new needs, new technologies, right? So for me, creativity is finding the right problem to solve. And this is where design comes in, right? Design, the whole design process, aside from making things look pretty, is all about understanding who the users are, what their needs are, and understanding whether directions in the solution space will actually kind of fit those needs. So that's how you bring things together, and that's what I talk about with innovation and creativity and execution.
Huh. It's fascinating for me to think about you reframing that question to that audience as how many of you consider yourself a creative problem solver?
Yeah.
And I bet a lot of hands would stay up. Because we consider that kind of creativity is just a natural part of being good at execution, right?
That's right.
And yet, I would be one of those people who put my hands down if you said, "Are you creative?"
Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely an interesting thought exercise. Before we get to the speed round, I did want you to comment on because I thought these were so helpful for our listeners. It was certainly helpful for me to think about. You described 4 phases of innovation readiness in an interview that you did that were super insightful. The 4 phases were lonely soldier phase, success in silos, push to pull, and then scaled. Can you talk a little bit more about these phases and like how you see them manifesting?
Yeah, so this came out of some experience. So back when I in my role at SAP, together with a couple colleagues, most notably a colleague that works with me right now, her name's Janaki Kumar. We we worked with other organizations that were looking to do an innovation transformation. Worked with executives and interviewed them, surveyed them to see what their journey was like, and these were the 4 phases that seem to emerge in terms of innovation readiness in large organizations. And typically it happens like this, right? Some executive, high level executive, will get inspired by listening to a TED talk or going to hearing IDEO or David Kelly talk about innovation,
or
and
Sam on the innovation engine. Yeah.
and let's see, so let's see what happens. We need this within our organization, right? So they nominate somebody. Scott, you're nominated. You're the person to transform my entire organization, my entire 30,000 person organization, right? That's the notion of a lonely soldier, right? You've got the high level executive mandate to do so. The executive doesn't know how to do it. Hopefully, you know how to do it, but maybe you might not know how to do it either. But you have the mandate now, and sheer like personality and will, you're able to kind of get going, right?
I've got goosebumps. I've been given that charge before.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then if you do a good enough job and people are excited about that, you start to go into the next phase. The next phase is success in silos because you've had your individual successes just because of your sheer will of force of personality. You're asked to do more, and you maybe get some resources, you get a team, but it's still only happening in silos, right? It's still top down. Scott is still leading this thing, and it's still limited. And it's really until the next phase, which is like the tipping point or the inflection point, where you go from push to pull. And what that means is instead of this being a top-down driven thing, the rest of the line of business leads are starting to notice that, not necessarily, it's not the ivory tower sort of thing. They don't know my business, but they're starting to see, wow, I'd like to bring some of what they're doing into my business. So instead of, before this gets pushed down from the top, let me go reach out and actually try to pull this into my organization. And I think that's a mindset shift where again it's usually not the top or the bottom, but you got to get the mind share of the middle management. And this is, like I said, the inflection point. And then finally, once you do enough of this, scale means you've actually started to change how your business runs, whether it's people that you hire, people with different skill sets, how you incentivize folks, and processes and governments and technologies, right? So those are kind of the 4 phases that we saw kind of emerge from the research that we did.
That is fantastic. That really is. It is a really helpful thing, I think, for companies who are interested in upping their innovation capacity to think about and to be okay also traversing those different phases, because it is a progression and that is natural. And then thinking, I was actually just helping a client think through their processes of how they do business case management, and thinking about how they could introduce new facets to that business case process that might lead to a different set of outcomes for them in the medium term. But it's good to be able to take stock and be okay with where you are and where you're not. And
yeah. And unfortunately, it's not always a linear progression, right? Sometimes you take a step back or 2 steps back, but
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we're never in a vacuum, right? So there's always a lot of things going in our context. All
yeah.
right, so thank you for indulging me on that, because I think those 4 phases are really, really helpful for companies who are wrestling with innovation and innovation progression.
Sure.
So thank you for sharing that. And we've actually been speaking with Janaki, so we're looking forward to talking to her some more. Speed round. So we like to close each episode with a speed round. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Fortunately, it's not quite as threatening as it sounds. So you're one of Stanford professor Larry. Actually, I don't know how to say his last name. Leifer or Leifer? It is Leifer. So like the German. Former PhD students. What was the toughest class you had with him?
Ironically, I only took one class with him, which is it was a fantastic class. It was at the time it was called ME 210. It's now called ME 310, but it was a industry sponsored year-long design challenge where you worked with people from multidisciplinary teams, sometimes even remote students from different schools, with an industry sponsored project. You got a budget and you had to deliver a mechanical product design solution, and that was great. Learned so much. Again. Maybe more about just team dynamics, learning how to work with stakeholders, and so on and so forth. I'm going to give a part B answer to this because he was my thesis advisor, and I think just working through a PhD thesis was probably the hardest thing because I was talking about finding the right problem to solve earlier. That's maybe one of the few examples in school where you're not just learning how to solve problems, but you really have to first find the problem to solve first. And I thought that was a great educational process as well.
Yeah, no, I went through. I have not been through a PhD, but I wrote a thesis, and there was definitely that. What question is worth actually trying to answer? Anyways,
Right.
it can be quite a hunt. So I am curious though, because it is fascinating to me to think about working on an industry project like that. There's no org structure in that team, right? So there you've got a bunch of creatives trying to obviously assert themselves. So yeah, that had to be a very interesting. Were you proud of what your team was able to produce?
Yeah, we were. I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent here. I mean, one of the so the way the class was set up is, there was also a bunch of PhD students that were just looking at the design process and looking at things like team dynamics and diversity in teams. And that's the thing I was going to say is what they actually found is, the more diversity in teams, the better the final score was over 20 years of these projects. People coming from not necessarily, well, yeah, all kinds of diversity, but technical backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, work experience backgrounds. But what that also led to was, that didn't mean that the teams that got along the best also performed the best, right? Because of the, you had so many different points of view. A lot of times those teams had a lot of friction along the way, but they were able to kind of work through the friction and bring the best to the solution. So that was some interesting research outcomes that came out of that.
Yeah, I always try to differentiate with teams on recognizing constructive tension versus destructive tension. They definitely are different, but tension, it should be part of the sport. That's just the nature of the beast. Rob?
Yes. So Sam, you are the owner of not 2, not 3, 4 patents. I'm sure they're like your kids, right? And it's tough to have a favorite, but which one are you most proud of?
I guess there's one that took the entire PhD to kind of come up with, right? So that one is probably my favorite. Just in a nutshell, again, in the context of creative collaboration, the thesis was that if you were able to capture multi modes of communication, right, not just what people say during a meeting, but also what people draw out on a whiteboard, and you were able to capture that, there's a link between what people draw and sometimes the most insightful things in a meeting. So instead of, if you weren't present at the meeting and you had to go back and review, you're not going to review 2 hours of brainstorming. But if you actually used the text and the drawings as an index into what people said, that would be a great way to capture the most salient and important parts of the conversation, right? So that's what the thesis is about.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I had an opportunity to do one of these innovation labs where they had artists who would just listen to the conversation and draw on the whiteboard these amazing creations. But I was it was stunning to then look at that as a reflection of the conversation, and it actually inspired a whole new set of ideas, even for those of us who were in the conversation.
That's right.
So that's fascinating. So along the same lines, you said that when we spoke before that your boss has many analogies to discuss how you do what you do. Can you share a few of these and the ones that stick with you?
Yeah, I mean, the CEO of the commercial bank, Doug Petno, has a lot of these things, and it's great. Like it's one of the reasons I took the job. He's so design friendly from that perspective. He'll say things like, "Hey, we got to go long on design," and what does that mean? It's like, well, we got to take the seat of the client. Like, okay, that's an interesting way to say it. And then the other favorite is know what you're building before you start chopping wood. I love that one because again, to me that captures exactly what we were talking about before, and finding the right problem to solve before creativity before execution. So those are a couple of the things that I would.
Those are awesome, fantastic. Well, Sam, thank you. It's great to have you on. I can only imagine the types of challenges you have overcome to get that seat at the table. And it's really a thrill and an honor to get to talk to you about this. And I'm sure our listeners will benefit from your experiences. So thank you.
Scott, Rob, pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.